I want to thank the class of 1970, and particularly 36 sponsors of the 50th reunion of that class for coming up with the idea of allowing us to get provoked in order to think differently, and for sponsoring the visits of every single one of the guests. I want to thank the people of communication for taping this, the people of Amherst Books. There will be a book signing immediately after the event today. And of course, all of you for coming. My name is Ilan Stavans, and I teach here in the Spanish department, I have been the host for this year of this series. Let me tell you what the protocol will be, and then we're going to begin right away. We will have a conversation for about 40 minutes between Amartya Sen and me. We're going to go back and forth on a number of topics. The theme of this year is globalism and its discontents. So in one way or another, I will try to keep the line of argument on the local and the global, and on the larger questions that we're all facing, particularly on election day, is the very ideology of globalism in question. Will it get another chance? Are we witnessing a kind of retrenchment of breaking down borders? Or are we simply seeing an impasse that will pass? After those 40 minutes, we're going to open it up to questions. There is a microphone to my left, and I invite those of you who have a comment or a question to please stand. In the interest of keeping the speed and the rhythm of the evening, we will probably have about 5 or 6 questions, because each of this will entail a response by Amartya Sen that will probably extend itself to about altogether 20 minutes, which would be the allocated time for that Q&A. And after that, Amartya will be signing books outside. I want to introduce Amartya Sen, who has been with us throughout the day. He arrived early. He teaches at Harvard, where he has been for over 30 years. Originally from India, he is a major figure in economics and in the marriage between economics and philosophy. Having concentrated his career, for which he has received, among many other awards and prizes, the Nobel Prize, the human development aspect of economics, and that is that we don't only see the accumulation of capital as the essential measure for success and for happiness and for freedom, but we see it in a larger context. According to this theory, we see it at the length of an individual's life, the capacity to get the major conditions and needs satisfied, like healthcare and education and daily survival met. He is the author of many books, and one of those books has been at the center of the course that I've been teaching. In the morning, we meet in the course with the students, and then in the evening we have this conversation. And that book is called Freedom, Development as Freedom. That it's out there for him to sign. I want to say something just very quickly before we begin the conversation, and that is that because we have had that conversation in the morning with the students, and then this event is also sponsored by NEPR's podcast, In Contrast, Amartya and I have been in conversation already twice, and this is the third one. So on occasion, you might hear something like what I said before, or this is in reference to a comment, and I'll make sure that whatever is mentioned in that context, I will contextualize it so that nobody loses the little bit of information. You take the microphone.
You take the form of my saying, how many times do I have to tell you?
That's right. So, Amartya Sen, it's a real honor to have you here. and a pleasure. Thank you for coming. I know it has been a big effort and the weather has not cooperated. Inequality has been a major concern of yours since your childhood. And that very inequality in your upbringing in India ended up defining how you perceive the potential for human development. You see the need to address those issues of inequality not only within a society, but within the larger community of nations, the so-called developed and the developing nations, and have been a prime force and promoter on the idea of thinking rationally how to bring people that live in poverty to a level where they have those basic needs and they can be called free. So I want to start with the question of inequality in a very large, ambitious way. Is inequality, Amartya, solvable? Can we imagine a world and make it a reality where the developed nations, those in control and access to power, will create the necessary context for those who do not have access to be lifted, the way it happened in China, the way it happened in Japan, but it hasn't happened in India, and it hasn't happened in other parts in Southeast Asia. Can we create the economic strategies in order to lift if not everybody, a large portion of that population that is described as poor? In what would those strategies need to be?
It's a very interesting question. Am I audible? Okay. I think a world without inequality, in terms of the disvalue of inequality, would be a very good world. And since it's a very important value, it's a world that's worth thinking about. On the other hand, avoidance of inequality is not the only value we have. We can think of many circumstances where we don't want that. Given left on their own, women live longer than men. We don't want to organize a world in which women live the same amount as men. Such worlds do exist, but they're not called just worlds. Mm-hmm. So it's one of the values. And therefore, while pursuing the really interesting thought experiments that you want us to indulge in, we have to bear in mind that there are other values to consider as well. And the way you could make women's lives the same as men in terms of longevity is one where women have far less freedom than they should have, given their natural capacity for withstanding disease and so on. So that's the first point to make. Secondly, a world without inequality isn't all that easy. I mean, you point that out, and rightly so, that in many ways Japan and China have succeeded in doing things that India has not, and you're absolutely right on that. And yet, China and Japan are also full of inequalities of other kinds, of various kinds. And so inequality has many dimensions. That's the main point of the second point I'm making. And therefore, it may be, I mean, the Japanese are very good in terms of providing similar care, nutritional and health, for boys and girls in a way that India or Pakistan may not. On the other hand, in terms of occupying senior positions in companies or in the governance, Japan does not have the same level of equality as even some of these countries, Pakistan or India, might have. So we have to take into account the multidimensionality of inequality. The third thing is that I think what we have to consider is to regard each of these inequalities as being important and have to ask, why are they important? And to the extent we can find an answer to that, we ought to see what we can do to reduce that inequality without overlooking the fact that there are other values with which we are also concerned. That generates a model of human reasoning, including particularly social reasoning, that requires a much bigger adventure in our thought. And that is something which I would say we should pursue as a general approach to how to do with inequality. But I think where your question becomes electric is that there are certain types of inequalities which are very strong in countries, in the Middle East, in South Asia. They're very strong. And yet there are subtle aspects. For example, if you look at sex-specific abortion, which affects girls in many parts of the world in a way that it doesn't affect boys. And the interest, roughly to give you some basic statistic, left to themselves about between 94 and 96 girls are born per 100 boys. That's not inequality, that's biology. It varies, but if you look at the European ratio, it's between 94 and 96. And the inequality of this kind is very strong in some parts of the world, in the Middle East, in North Africa. It's strong in India and Pakistan. Not so much in Bangladesh, oddly enough. In India, it's about 93 girls per boys. And despite the much greater level of equality that Chinese women have compared with men vis-a-vis Indian women vis-a-vis women, the Chinese ratio at birth is actually lower than 92. It was not long ago, 86. It's gone up. And oddly, India falls into two parts. All of North, every northern and western state, running from Punjab, Haryana, Kashmir, UP, down to Gujarat and Maharashtra, have a much lower ratio than the European ratio of 94 to say 96. Whereas every state in east and south of India fall in the within the European band. The Chinese have a lower ratio because it has a similar ratio to north and west of India. The oddity is, and this is a new thing I found, which I never looked at it, but then I thought I will, that even in countries which are very advanced in Asia, like Singapore and Hong Kong and Taiwan, the ratio is below the European ratio, and therefore below the East Indian ratio and below the Bangladesh ratio. So there is a problem, there is an issue where culture and economics intermix. And so it's a very complicated question. We don't think of Singapore and Hong Kong being unequal in this respect because women do so well there in other respects. But when it comes to voice preference, there is a lingering voice preference in all of over Asia, with the exception of Japan, that is striking. So I think what we have to do is, as I get older and older, I've recently become 85, and that's a gigantic ratio. Not long ago, I wondered how people could live at that kind of age. But now that I am there, I pontificate. And in the context of pontification, it seems to me that we have to give reasoning a much bigger span. That is, the multidimensionality is very important. We don't know whether the Chinese and the Singaporean and the Hong Kong, right, and the Taiwanese suffer women suffer in a way that we would not expect in other ways. And these have not been studied much. They need to be studied. So, I have not led any kind of life other than academic. At the age of 23, I was appointed to a university teaching job, and I've held that position all my life, and I've never had a serious non-academic job. But one of the results of that is that I'm continuously trying to invent new problems. and this is a new problem to offer, and it's not been discussed much. If I looked at, I think I know the gender literature well, but it hasn't been, and we have to look at why it's the case. And then going further, why is it that in Japan, despite all the equality that you get in education and science and so on, in politics and in business leadership, there is this gap? So I think we have to look at this inequality issue at many different levels. And I'm glad you asked the question. And what I'm saying is that it's a much bigger issue than, you are pointing out rightly to some tantalizingly nasty aspects of it. I'm saying that other than what is immediately, visibly nasty, there are nastiness of a kind that we have to look into, and it's important.
I will return to the topic of reason, because it's a theme that runs through your work in how to approach challenges. But I want to move momentarily to that other topic that has been central, and it is in the book that we have been discussing, development as freedom. Your argument being that one cannot think of somebody being capable of being free without the basic needs being satisfied. I mentioned some of those needs: healthcare, education, etc. It seems on the premise as a very obvious statement, but the power of it is enormous. And I would like to, you and I have talked a little bit about this, but I would like to explain briefly to the audience, what do you understand by freedom? And if freedom is the same across cultures and across times, if different cultures understand what freedom is differently, what is valued in freedom, or is there a universal Platonic view of freedom that you are proposing here, or that you are endorsing, and that the ways that each society takes in regards to it is secondary, so to speak?
Yeah, very exciting question. You see, I think what we convey by freedom, of course, depends on the linguistic convention of that area, in a way that, say, Antonio Gramsci or later Wittgenstein, not early Wittgenstein, discussed. And yet, there is a commonality in the notion of freedom, which we have to respect, even as we take cognizance of the diversity of how the different types of freedom come into our story. Now, the basic idea that a person, should be free or at liberty to do things that he or she wants to do, unless there is a very strong reason against it, as a basic idea of freedom, is a common one across the world. People might say, I don't think freedom is such a good thing, as Mr. Duarte in Philippines often does, and the president of this country occasionally comes too close to saying, though he hasn't actually said it in that form. But yet, when Duarte said, I don't think freedom is the right thing, or when Lee Kuan Yew, with whom I had a series of arguments, says that it's the Western values that emphasize freedom, and the Eastern values don't, where I argued that he's mistaken in his reading. But he wasn't saying it isn't freedom. He was saying that it's not as valuable as Westerners have made us think. And so in that context, we can use the idea of freedom, whether we like it or not, in a big way, as a concept of importance. And that seems to me to be fairly universal, not the liking of it, not the loving of it, but the recognition that it's a big issue. But then, when it comes to what are the important things to preserve, then of course it may depend from the minuscule aspect of culture, whether you are allowed to pray, and whether it's not minuscule. John Stuart Mill wrote a book about it called On Liberty, and similarly what you are allowed to eat. And then it goes into more difficult territory, what you allow others to eat, which has become such a big issue in India, where there was never a particular problem about what you ate, but suddenly people have got much more worried about what others are eating rather than what they are themselves eating. And it's an incredible collapse of a value system. But for the moment, and this is not true of India as a whole, those who believe that have never been not only a majority, they have never come close to being a majority. And yes, there's a lot of people take that view. So we have to note that the differences arise not only between regions and countries, but within a region and within a country. Nothing was as clear over the last 2 or 3 days that two Americans, one possibly born in Hawaii, and the other born in New York, as both had presidential experience in America, have widely different views about what they would like to preserve. That doesn't mean that they're any different. They have different nations. They're the same. I think the main thing to recognize there is that our differences don't arise only from where we come from. I mean, just to give a test, where actually I have to be very careful. I tried what an Amherst curry would look like over dinner, and the results of it are on my shirt now, so I have to keep my tie above it. But
to cover it.
Cover it. Where do you think this tie could be from?
You mean where you bought it?
Where was it made? and it has a symbolic value. But I don't think you would ever guess. It's from a Muslim country, namely Bangladesh. It's a tie of Dhaka University. It's not green. It doesn't have a crescent moon. It's a red tie, which might make me look like a revolutionary. And, you know, it varies, but that's part of its culture too, as we knew in 1971. And it played a big part. That's part of the culture. I think the fact is that there are big variations. What is the common is some idea that people, A, should be able to do what they really think are important for them and important in their view for the world, and B, should have what you told earlier, the basic means which make their exercise of their freedom feasible, and food, education, shelter, medicine play a part in that. That is the commonality. Within that there will be big differences. But that's not different from other ideas that we have. The nature of kindness as we understand it varies, nature of cruelty as we understand it varies, and so on. So I would say that when I talk about development as freedom, I'm trying to pursue an idea which has a globality, a global understanding, despite the fact that it can take many different forms.
Amartya, do we learn to be free? Is this the process and the product of an intellectual, a reasonable development? Or is that freedom that you're talking about intrinsic to the very nature of who we are, regardless of the access of education and to the development of one's reason?
I would say the comparison here is what Noam Chomsky says about our ability to generate language and grammar. That is, we have a capacity to understand. And that was, after all, the big difference between the early Wittgenstein of Tractatus and the later Wittgenstein of philosophical investigation and understanding, in which, by the way, the Marxist thinker Gramsci played a very big part, mainly through the influence of Theo Schaffer, who actually, as it happened, was one of my teachers. But in Trinity College, they were both fellows, Wittgenstein and Schaffer. And that thought was something that Schaffer won over Wittgenstein. But if you take Chomsky, which is probably the most articulate view of that, there is an ability for us to make grammar ourselves. If you say something which is awfully wrong grammatically, even without any training, we would, we would see that there is a problem. And I think our ability to speak grammatically then improves. If you think about an Indian grammarian, Panini, 4th century BC, what was his contribution? He accepted the universality of grammar, but he said that people very often use it wrongly. And therefore, let me get these rules. He wrote 4,000 rules. There's a problem there, because how are these generative or are these dicta by you? So, at the moment I've given up teaching economics. I teach math and philosophy mostly, and this year I'm teaching with a mathematician called Barry Mather and an economist and mathematician called Eric Maskin. I'm teaching a course called axiomatic reasoning. So I'm talking about Panini, Wittgenstein, Chomsky, and Gramsci and so on. And the right answer to your question is you can, three things. A, we have a sense of freedom, which is intrinsic in the way our sense of grammar is. We could systematically apply reason to it and subject it to scrutiny. And C, many of the reasoning and rules that would appeal to us would turn out to be mistaken, so that if rules represent scrutiny, there is need for scrutiny of scrutiny. That's roughly my answer.
Okay. I want to move you to another a freedom-related question before we go to the topic of reason and politics and globalism today. And this is something, Amartya, that you and I have talked today once, but I think this audience is going to be very interested in.
Yeah.
I mentioned to you, I would like for you to address the idea, the potential idea of an individual choosing the opposite of freedom in making this an active choice. So I told you during the podcast that I teach a course in a nearby jail. And I have become close to the inmates and have found out that some inmates, all of them are male, and many of them are from Springfield and other surrounding areas, literally would prefer to be in the jail, particularly in certain periods of the year, the winter, the spring. This is how they have told it to me, because being outside, the inclement weather conditions, the violence on the street, the opioid epidemics and other drugs, being in the jail is preferable to being outside. And they also say that the benefits that they get in the jail are double or triple what they get outside. They get food, they get shelter, they get classes, and so on. So here is a paradigm of a series of individuals who actually, one told me, would commit a petty crime sometime coming to the winter in order to be able to be in jail for the next X amount of months and then go out. This is an active decision of limiting one's freedom in order to be able to benefit from that absence. So this is a choice that comes from reason, and that ultimately is a statement on what is happening on the streets.
Yeah, we discussed this a bit earlier, so I have to be careful in not boring you with the similar answer.
No, you don't have to worry about me. These are the people you have to entertain.
Of course, in order to commit a sufficiently petty crime that sends you to prison between December and April, and then to come out as the daffodils come out from this jail, requires pretty fine tuning of crime and the judicial system. But let's imagine that you can. I strongly recommend, for those who have not read it, a collection of short stories by O. Henry called 4 Million. And 4 million is the number of New Yorkers at the time when he wrote it. And one of the stories is about a guy who is very depressed at the winter coming. He doesn't know of any way of earning an income. So he thinks, wouldn't it be better to be in prison? Think of the heat, warm rooms, breakfast ready in the morning. And he tries to get himself arrested. And most of the story is the difficulty in his getting arrested. And he tries to misbehave in the street, running around, obstructing cars, and so on. And then one of the policemen who is about to arrest is told by another policeman, saying these are Yaleys celebrating their victory over Harvard in the game, and we have been told not to arrest them. So he doesn't get arrested. So this goes on, he is very frustrated. And then he sits in the park and he says, what's wrong with me? Why can't I change myself and start earning an income? Look for a good job. Maybe, I know jobs are rare, but maybe if I try hard, I might get it. And then it gets full of resolve, saying, I am not going to do that. At which moment a policeman puts his hand on his shoulder and saying, you are under arrest for loitering. So that's the story. And it's a sad story. It's a comment on society. It's a comment on the individual as well. And the comment has a similarity with yours. But notice what's common between your story and O. Henry's is that they're not wanting to be locked up. They're looking for a warm room, a meal, a care in case you fall down and break your leg. And these are not imprisonment. These are the associated benefits that in the imprisonment system in this country happen to come with imprisonment. In many countries they don't, by the way. And so what these persons are seeking is not wanting to be bolted out. They're seeking a hot room, a warm room, and food and care. So I wouldn't draw from it that anyone is choosing unfreedom. If somebody said, you can get a warm room, and you can get breakfast when you like, and a meal, and you can get a little bit of a pocket money too, and you don't have to stay in the jail, you can go around, I bet he would choose that. Which indicates that it's not, you shouldn't interpret it as someone preferring unfreedom to freedom. Someone prefers the freedom of having hot, warm room and food and a little income over the freedom of being able to roam around and go where you like.
I am struck by now, but throughout your work, you use the opposite of freedom as unfreedom. You don't use other words. You don't use other words that would come faster to one's mind, so imprisonment but you use unfreedom. That's the opposite of freedom, in your mind?
Well, I think it would be difficult not to think of unfreedom as the opposite of freedom.
And unfreedom is the absence of freedom.
Yeah. I mean, there's many of these ideas we get by looking at the negation of it. It sounds frightfully Hegelian, what I'm saying, but it's not that Hegelian. The dialectics of it is that you say, how do you know this guy has no freedom? That question. Or you could say the other, why do you think that this person really has a lot of freedom? Well, he can roam around. Doesn't have the unfreedom being locked up. He actually manages to eat and have a reasonable, warm room, comfortable room. Again, the opposite of not having them, which is unfreedom. There are many ideas which require engagement from both ends, but the engagement from the negative end is often much more articulate than from the positive end. And I would say freedom is one of those ideas. I mean, when I first started using it, people would say that there's no such word in English.
I was going to say the folks of the OED would say we haven't registered it.
Well, OED happen to have unfreedom. Yeah. As it happens, they do.
Oh. Have to open it.
Yeah. Because I'm not that original. It has been used before.
So, Amartya, I want to ask you about globalism today. Do you think that we are, with the rise of populism and the emergence of fascist groups in fascism in countries like Poland and Hungary and Brazil, are we entering a period in which globalism is severely questioned and maybe even in retreat? Or is this an impasse that will pass?
I think there have been ups and downs, certainly you're right. But it's not the case that what we are witnessing now is a totally unprecedented phenomenon. When I first arrived in Trinity College in Cambridge as an undergraduate, I was struck when I went to the chapel to see how many Trinity men had fallen in the war. Their names were there on the side of the chapel, and so many of them that the entire chapel walls were taken up by their names. So when the Second War happened, their names had been put in the anti-chapel. I was absolutely shocked by the number of people who had died of one particular age group, a college of 700 students, and that many people in 3.5 years. It was amazing for me. And what were they fighting about? Britain versus Germany versus France. You know, very far from globalism. I don't think today, despite everything, no one would think that the French and the English are intrinsically, or the French and the Germans, are intrinsically hostile to each other. I think we have been in that kind of a situation again and again, and we have overcome them. And I think in the context of one of our debates, I quoted also an old Italian story to indicate that what may appear to be new may not be that new. And I might as well repeat that story. This is about I have to mention that I know a lot of these stories because my late wife died very early from cancer, was from Italy, and she died of cancer, but her father was...
Put the microphone close to you.
Sorry. Her father was shot by Mussolini, in fact, 2 days in Rome, 2 days before Americans liberated Rome. He was editing the Avanti, the newspaper, the socialist newspaper. But naturally, one of the things that you do is that you have a lot of stories about your enemies. And this is about a fascist recruiter who goes to a village and trying to recruit for the fascist party. And he explains how good Mussolini has been. The trains are all running on time. Malaria has been eliminated from Latina and the area on the coast. And he's saying that you ought to join the fascist party. So this very silly Italian peasant says, "Look, listen, your arguments are very good, but I can't join the fascist party because, you see, my father was a socialist. My grandfather was a socialist. My great-grandfather was a socialist. How could I possibly join the fascist party?" So the fascist recruiter said, "What kind of a silly argument is that? How does it make a difference that your father and grandfather were socialists? Suppose your father was a murderer and your grandfather was a murderer. What would you have done then?" To which this silly Italian peasant says, "Oh, in that case, of course, I will join the fascist party." So what may appear to be a new problem may not be all that new.
But you know, just maybe 2 hours ago, you were telling me on the same vein, Amartya, that you are surprised that racism in the United States and anti-Semitism in the United States are popping up their ugly heads. Are you really surprised? If you're saying this is recurrent, this is ongoing, what we're seeing is something that we should have expected.
Yeah. Well, I'm surprised at some level, in the sense that I wasn't expecting it. When I have thought through it, am I still surprised? No, not really. Am I surprised altogether? I don't know. It depends on how much thought I've put into it. No, I think since the 1930s, anti-Semitism was such a big issue. And in the time of the civil liberties, civil rights movement in this country, since the color issue was so visited, that there was reason to think that these battles have been won. And it appears that they have not. That's a surprise.
Can these battles be won?
Yes, they can be won. But the fact that they have happened is because there is a vulnerability there which can be exploited. And we have seen that, not just in the United States. I mean, we've seen in Hungary, seen in Poland, and oddly enough, we've seen even in Italy, in a way, in a country which saved hundreds of thousands of people from the sea in order not to allow them to drown. And then suddenly the Italians won't save anybody else. The Portuguese have to come across the sea to pick up these terribly challenged, drowning individuals. So I think there are complications in social thinking, and we have to think in every issue. I mean, even this election has brought out some issues that are important, and not all of them are negative issues. The fact that even the day before the election, an ad by the president of this country would not be published by Fox News, would not be carried by Fox News, which is not well known to be a left-wing publication. It indicates that there is a certain amount of thinking going on.
Hopefully. We're going to move to the question and answer session. So I have one more question, but I'm inviting the audience to join on my left if people have comments, and if you do, to make them in a succinct way so that there's room for others. And the question that I have, Amartya, is that the one that is connected with reason, and something that you push for and you support. Are we not seeing a crisis of reason at a time in the United States, today being election day, when there seem to me to be two versions of truth? The truth that comes from one ideological side and the truth that comes from the other side. I was seeing a cartoon of the New Yorker that has a newscaster that says, and that was the report about the weather from the Democratic Party. Now let's go to the one from the Republican Party. Is reason, how do you rescue, how do you return, how do you reposition reason, the power of the intellect, at a time when we seem to be divided by alternative truths, in the embrace of those truths, in medias that foster the loyalty to those truths, in spite of what you said about Fox News on occasion taking a break?
Yeah. I think we'll never be in a position where truth would not be challenged by something else, which is described as being truth. So the idea of truth versus truth is not a new one. In fact, all debates about epistemology are in fact about debates about truth versus truth, about the flat earth, about many other things that we can talk about. No, I think um, what we're looking at is claim of certain things to be called the truth, and the opposite of it to be fake. Um, and that is the way epistemic debates have always progressed. I mean, the flat earth people described the round earth people to be fake speakers, and indeed this was a major thing, and been debated. There was a Iranian mathematician who went to India in 11th century, and he was commenting on Aryabhat, who was a great Indian mathematician. 499, he wrote his famous book, where he claimed the Earth was a sphere, the Earth is going around its own axis, and the Sun is not going around us, and eclipses are caused by the shadow of the Earth on the Moon, and the Moon obscuring the Sun, all the ones we would like to think. And since the Earth is churning and things are not being thrown out, indicate that there is some force which the Sanskrit word comes very close to gravity, which is pulling. That was 499. And then he is immediately denounced by one of his disciples, Brahmagupta, and who is the believer and who describes all these as fake news or fake science. But what Al-Biruni says in 11th century, 600 years later, is asking Brahmagupta that if you really think that Aryabhat is giving fake news, why is it that after vilifying him, you then calculate the next eclipse of the moon and the sun by using his method rather than your method that you have been taught by your religion? Actually, this debate, 11th century, 1010 AD, it's remarkably interesting.
Yeah.
And these are debates that will continue. But they're not the world of fake news. They are truth and counterclaims on truth. We're not going to get out of that, and we shouldn't.
We should.
We should, because that is what epistemic debates are for. What went wrong here is the impossibility of listening to this argument that because of the fake news was played up in such a big way, you couldn't. But that was Al-Biruni's point, that Brahmagupta not only drowned Aryabhat, but he would not allow anyone who was a religious Hindu to believe in what these thoughts were without somehow committing apostasy.
Yeah, which is that where the danger is, where the tyranny is. First question or comment?
Hi. So I want to ask about whether or not we should be coming up with new ideological visions that would actually lead to increasing agency and freedom, because we live in a world where both populists on the left and on the right are responding to what they see as failures of liberalism. They think that, on the left they'll say that liberalism doesn't actually grant agency or civil rights or economic freedom, that it's impossible to constantly keep liberalism alive and think that we can reform it, we should go beyond. The right thinks that liberalism is fundamentally leading to the decay of culture and institutions. And so I guess my question is, because the crisis, all of our political crises come from what are seen as failures of liberalism, shouldn't we go beyond liberalism in our vision and ideology?
If you accept that analysis. Mm-hmm. If you don't accept the analysis, I think there are two levels. First of all, is that thesis correct? And there's a debate there. And second, if it turns out to be, in your view, correct, how do you respond to that? I think you're addressing the second, but there is the first question also, as to whether that is a good analysis of liberalism or not. And you could also even argue that liberalism is mistaken, but not for these reasons, but for some other reasons. So these are all territories of reasoning, and if you arrive at the position that liberalism is mistaken, and for these reasons, then your next question that you're asking is exactly right. Shouldn't we now go beyond it? We should under those circumstances. But this is only after the first part of the debate had been engaged and settled. You see, I think it's a similar thing that I was debating with Lee Kuan Yew. That is, he was arguing that the Asian values did not value freedom, it valued discipline. And then we could ask the question, if that's the case, how would we incorporate discipline in a modern society? Now, that question would become important if the first part is correct, namely that Asians do not value freedom, they value only discipline. And I was trying to argue that that's mistaken. By the way, I might say, since Lee Kuan Yew is gone, he was a wonderful person to argue with, because the asymmetry in our position was unbelievable. I landed at the airport, and when I was being taken to the hospital, to the hotel, the chap who was doing it, he was then called, he was the prime minister and then called senior minister, and then finally he was called mentor minister. So I was told that the mentor minister has said that if I wanted to visit the mentor minister would be quite happy to see me. So I said, under those circumstances, I do want to visit the mentor minister.
I guess
So
I
went
just
to him.
want to quickly ask, do you personally think liberalism is mistaken?
I don't think it's mistaken for those reasons. But what I'm saying that his main thing was to argue immediately that, not your question, but the question beyond that, namely that if they do not value freedom, there may be argument other than the one that Lee Kuan Yew is giving, which make this proposition, which is the one which you didn't want to hear, because he wanted to come to the guillotine on that. But he was keen on going beyond the guillotine and asking, could it be that I am wrong, I'm right, and you are wrong, but not for the reason I've given, but could there be other reasons? I was very impressed with it.
Next question.
Thank you, Professor Sen, for this wonderful lecture. My question is, why do you think neoliberal capitalism is continue to be so popular even after the global financial crisis? And do you see a sort of a socialist or utopian alternative to the system?
You know, my real difficulty in dealing with neoliberalism is I've never quite understood what it is defined to mean. When someone describes another person as a neoliberal, all I know is that the first person doesn't like the second one. Other than that, I have no further informational content in that, because it could be neoliberal as a capitalist society with everything that goes with it, national health service, a social security system, a pension system. Or neoliberal could be one where you have a capitalist society without any of these. Or it could be a capitalist society where people who express different points of view are in one pretext or another arrested. Now, I've seen neoliberal being used in all these ways. So I really, and you and I don't think he would allow that kind of leisurely discussion now, since we don't have that much time. But sometime he and I are going to chat about how do you define neoliberal, and then we can take on this question, exactly the question you're asking under that definition. There is a lack of articulation in the use of the term neoliberal. I mean, this is it's one of the reasons why people like Azar Berlin spend so much time talking about liberty, positive liberty, negative liberty. I even met, when I was visiting Berkeley, a woman who was doing a PhD on Azar Berlin's distinction. So I said, so other than these two, how many distinctions did you find in Azar Berlin? She said 28. So I think there is quite a lot of ambiguity there. But underlying that, with any definition, your question will make sense. The question is, which question?
Next.
So, as you mentioned, somebody who would, when you're talking about freedom and
Sorry, I'm getting...
when you're talking about...
I can't hear it.
Can you hear me now?
Pardon?
Hello?
Can you hear now?
Check 1, 2, 3.
Go ahead. If not, I'll translate.
So when you're talking about freedom and unfreedom, when you were having this conversation, we talked about, I heard about how an inmate in this area will be able to escape the winter or the harsh climate conditions living in the prison for a month or for a short period of time. I mean, I'm from India, and if I draw a comparison, I would never see anybody wanting to go to jail for maybe like...
Anyone wanting what?
Anybody wanting to go to jail for like a short period of time because nobody wants to sleep.
That's true everywhere, isn't it?
Yeah, no, but like, I mean, I just want to see the cultural difference you can draw in this whole scenario.
Are there people going around clamoring to want to go to jail?
No, in the sense, I mean, I don't know, maybe I'm not framing it correctly, but what I'm trying to say is nobody wants to go to jail in India because you don't want to sleep without a fan or not get a meal. And you're going to jail over here just to get all those amenities. So how do you draw that comparison?
I think it's something that you were talking about, Amartya, before, which is that the conditions of imprisonment in the United States are very different from conditions in other countries, where jails are crowded, where there's no food, where there is different types of diseases and violence.
Yeah.
I'm suspecting that is the...
Yeah. I didn't think that the conditions of prison in the United States are certainly better than that in India. But I must say, nothing is going to make me long to go to a U.S. prison on grounds that it's such a wonderful experience waiting for me. Are you saying that our opposition to imprisonment may depend on what the content of the imprisonment may be, what being imprisoned entails? If that's the case, I quite agree. Yeah. And increasingly I'm convinced that if I have to choose not to go to prison, Saudi Arabia would be one of the high countries where I wouldn't like to go to prison. And for various reasons that I could articulate. I think maybe you're making the point that the badness of imprisonment is not something independent of the nature of the nastiness of imprisonment that we have. And if that's the case, I quite agree with you. And as such, we may not just talk about the disvalue of the nastiness of imprisonment, but articulate it more. I agree with that. And we know, I mentioned Saudi Arabia, I can name 6 other countries where I wouldn't like to go to prison at all. And mostly I wouldn't like to go to prison anywhere, quite frankly.
Next question.
Hi, I'm wondering what your opinions are in terms of population control as a tactic among development agencies, and where the freedoms and unfreedoms lie between eugenics and increased access to reproductive rights.
I didn't get the last bit.
Where you think that the freedoms and unfreedoms lie between eugenics and population control and access to reproductive rights.
By the way, I have a paper exactly on that subject written 30 years ago, I'm afraid, in the Chicago Law Review called Population and Coercion. It was a lecture in the Chicago Law School.
To check it out.
Pardon?
I'll have to check it out.
You check it out, yeah. Yeah, absolutely. That's the right attitude. I think there are three problems here. First of all, why is a smaller population and a lower population growth important? It's not a rhetorical question I'm asking for what reason. Certainly not for Malthusian reasons. There's absolutely no evidence that that's a problem. For example, if you're looking at, Malthus thought that in 1800, the Earth already had, when it had 1 billion people, had more people than it could possibly sustain. If you look at the population today, it's 7 times that. On the other hand, if you look at food in particular, the relative price of food compared with non-food products, industrial goods, for example, is over the century enormously low. So if you consider an economic incentive, if you raise the food prices, we can generate a lot more food than we have right now. The difficulty isn't with food. The difficulty is with the environment and the way it generates global warming and so forth. And ultimately, the reasoning would lead one to the idea that reducing the population growth rate is, by and large, in most circumstances, a good idea. Secondly, how could you do it? Now, one of the things we do know from the history of population control in the world, that coercing people to cut down population growth rate is never been successful anywhere. I wrote a paper in the New York Times when the Chinese abolished the one-child policy to point out that the Chinese never got a slightest benefit in reducing the population growth from a one-child policy. The population growth rate, the fertility rate, came down from about 5 to about 2.4 in the decade preceding the one-child policy's introduction. And since then, it's gone down from 2.4 to 1.7 or 1.8 over 4 or 5 decades. It never did anything. It created a lot of agony, though. And the third, which is a more positive point, is that we know what cuts down population growth rate. And that is women's education and women's gainful employment. When I was first working on it, actually I was working in the center of somebody who was a postdoctoral fellow of mine called Mamata Murthy, who was working on it. So that if you took all the Indian districts, and in those days he began with data from 70s, the fertility rate varied from 6 per couple to 1.7 per couple. And there were only 2 variables which explained it, and that's women's gainful employment and women's literacy. Between them, they explain about 88%. And there was no factor other than that. So, as it happens, women's literacy and women's gainful employment have many other benefits other than population growth rate. So it becomes a part of a story of a good things that development could happen. Development and freedom, as you keep quoting the title of my book, it includes those things in a big way, even without bringing the population. So happens, it also have tremendously powerful effect in reducing the population growth rate. So that's the way I would answer your question. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, definitely. Thank you.
Okay, thank you.
Next one. We have two more.
Hi, Professor. I'm a Singaporean, and I grew up reading your arguments with Lee Kuan Yew. Currently, after a period of liberalization in Singapore, it feels like politics in Singapore is turning more right-wing, and we're embracing more like the government is returning to its more older authoritarian roots in some ways. And it seems like in India as well, you see the rise of more authoritarian right-wing politics. And I'm curious to know if you think that more liberal politics is on the way for Asia, or if ultimately Lee Kuan Yew kind of won that debate on whether Asians embrace liberalism or illiberalism.
It's a very good question. I would distinguish between the different ways in which the authoritarianism has come. I'm very critical of the government of India, but still it is the case, which I celebrate, that I can publish an article criticizing the government of India in at least 4 or 5 newspapers with wide circulation, which is not easy in Singapore. But on the other hand, if you look at the way Singapore has treated the ethnic question, the way the minorities are treated, it's completely dramatically better than what's happening to the minorities in India today, especially Muslims, but not only Muslims. And in the past, the same, the caste question is also a minority question, often. And so authoritarianism has taken many different forms. There's no reason why we cannot have non-authoritarian governance of all kinds. So we don't have to praise India for allowing free newspapers, and Indians read more newspapers than any other country in the world by a long, long margin. You cannot excuse Indians on grounds that, well, maybe the ethnic issue they haven't engaged well, but there are other things. That's not a good enough argument. You should be able to have both. The same applies to Singapore. The fact that they have been ethnically such a dual, really. I mean, there's very few countries, even compared with Europe, where minorities have as much facility as Singaporean minorities have. And so I would say we have to think of authoritarianism with the kind of diversity that authoritarianism requires. It's a similar answer to my gender question, namely gender bias, gender inequality can take many different forms. And so can authoritarianism, and we have to be against each of them.
Wonderful. Last question?
Sorry to disappoint, but my question has been asked in various forms, so thank you very much for your talk.
Okay. Amartya, this has been extraordinary. If there was any doubt that conversations like this enable us to understand how minds work, you have given us that opportunity to see how you think, how you process, how you engage, and how you build argument. It has been a real pleasure. Thank you for coming.
Thank you very much.